Admiral Zerath Kal had conquered 14 worlds without losing a single ship in the opening strike. Earth would be his 15th, and by far the easiest. He stood on the bridge of the Devourer's wake, arms folded behind his back, studying the blue-green planet on the view screen the way a butcher studies a lamb. No orbital defense grid, no warships, no signals of resistance in over 60 years of quiet observation. The Corvth Dominion scouts had catalogued Earth's militaries as a curiosity, nuclear-tipped relics, propeller aircraft compared to Dominion tech, and a species too busy fighting each other to notice the stars. "Send the report to the Council," Zerath said. "Recommend immediate annexation." His science officer hesitated. "Sir, the Council authorized only a diplomatic envoy, not a strike." Zerath smiled the way predators smile. "Diplomacy is simply war conducted slowly. I intend to be efficient." 40,000 kilometers below, in a windowless room built into the bones of a decommissioned Pacific weather station, Commander Elena Reyes sat very still, watching a console that had not blinked in 19 years. It blinked now. Her coffee went cold in her hand. The screen read a designation she had memorized on her first day of training and never once expected to see outside a drill. Unidentified mass entry, outer system, threshold protocol advised. She didn't call her supervisor. She didn't call the Pentagon. She picked up a red phone that had no dial tone, no ringer, and had sat untouched in its cradle since the day she'd been assigned to this post. And she said 4 words into it. "They're here." Confirmed. Somewhere under the Nevada desert, in a facility that did not appear on any map, any satellite image, or any budget line ever submitted to Congress. Lights that had been dark for 40 years came on one row at a time, stretching for kilometers into the rock. Elena had joined Project Threshold at 26, recruited out of naval intelligence by a man who told her almost nothing and asked her to sign paperwork that legally did not exist. General Marcus Webb had been the one who'd looked her in the eye across a table in a room with no windows and said, "What I'm about to tell you will change how you see every headline you've ever read. Once I tell you, you can't unknow it. Are you sure?" She'd said yes. She'd always wondered if he regretted her answer. Now, 6 years later, she watched his face fill her screen from 3,000 kilometers away, older, grayer, but not surprised. Marcus Webb had never once looked surprised in the time she'd known him. It was, she'd decided long ago, the most unsettling thing about him. "Confirm the reading," he said. "Confirmed. Multiple contacts, deceleration burn consistent with controlled entry. They're not passing through, sir. They're arriving." A long pause. On the screen, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the closest thing to emotion she'd ever seen from him. "Then it's finally happening," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "After all this time." "Sir, after what time?" "Nobody has ever told me what we're actually preparing for. I've spent 6 years running drills for a scenario nobody explains. You'll understand soon. Everyone will." He straightened, and the moment of vulnerability vanished behind the mask of command she knew so well. "Elena, listen carefully. Whatever you see in the next 72 hours, whatever it looks like from the surface, Earth is not defenseless. It has never been defenseless, but if we show our hand too early, we lose everything we've built to hide. Do you understand?" "No," she said honestly, "but I trust you." "Then trust me a little longer." 200 kilometers above the Pacific, a Corvth envoy shuttle broke atmosphere in a shroud of superheated plasma, trailing an escort of 6 fighters in tight formation. Vesa Orn, Zerath's chief tactical advisor, watched the descent from the command deck with the flat, appraising stare of someone who had personally overseen the opening moves of 9 separate planetary annexations. Something about this one felt wrong, though she could not yet say why. "Sensor sweep," she ordered. "Full spectrum, surface and subsurface." "Subsurface sweep will take time, ma'am. Their planet has considerable geological interference. I don't care. Run it." The technician obeyed without argument. Vesa had earned a reputation for being right about the things that felt wrong, and nobody on this ship wanted to be the one who ignored her twice. Zerath found her there an hour later, still watching the readouts. You look troubled, Vesa, on the eve of an easy conquest. Nothing about this conquest has felt easy to me, Admiral. Not since we entered the system. 60 years of surveillance say otherwise. 60 years of surveillance from orbit, she corrected. We have never had eyes beneath their surface. Their cities sit atop bedrock our scanners can't fully penetrate. That has never bothered me before today. Today it does. Zareth waved a dismissive hand. Primitive shielding from their own radiation testing, nothing more. You're seeing ghosts, Vesa. This species builds weapons that still burn fuel. They have not so much as touched the edge of real spaceflight. Whatever they're hiding, it isn't a fleet. Vesa said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than argument ever could, and she wanted, very badly, for something to unsettle the Admiral before it was too late for either of them. The envoy shuttle touched down on a stretch of tarmac outside a hastily assembled diplomatic compound near Geneva, cameras from every nation on Earth broadcasting the landing live to a planet holding its collective breath. World leaders who, 48 hours earlier, had been arguing over trade tariffs now stood shoulder to shoulder on a reviewing platform, faces arranged into careful, practiced calm. Elena watched the feed from Threshold's command center, jaw tight. They look terrified, muttered the young analyst beside her. They're not terrified, Elena said quietly. They're acting terrified. There's a difference. She had been in the room 3 days earlier when the surviving heads of state who'd been read into Threshold's existence had rehearsed exactly this moment. How to stand, how to speak, how to buy time without revealing that the fear on their faces was a performance decades in the making. On the tarmac, the shuttle's ramp lowered with a hiss of alien atmosphere venting into Earth's air. Vesa Orn descended first, flanked by armored escorts twice the height of the humans waiting to greet them. She surveyed the gathered leaders with open, undisguised contempt. Representatives of Earth, she said, her translator device rendering the words in flawless, toneless English. You stand in the presence of the Corvth Dominion. Compliance ensures your survival. Resistance ensures your extinction. You have one rotation of this planet to decide. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, a woman named Adaisi Chukwu, who had been briefed on Threshold only 6 hours earlier, and had aged a decade in that time, stepped forward with a steadiness that cost her everything she had. We will need to consult our people, she said. Democracy takes time. Vesa studied her for a long moment, long enough that the silence became its own kind of threat. You have time, she said finally. Use it wisely. It will not be offered twice. She turned back toward the shuttle, and that was when her wrist display, still quietly running its subsurface scan in the background, chimed with a priority alert she had not expected to see for hours yet, if ever. She stopped mid-stride. Beneath her feet, beneath the tarmac, beneath the compound, beneath the entire stretch of Earth's crust for a radius she could not yet calculate, something vast had just registered on her sensors. A gravitational signature too large, too dense, too perfectly organized to be geological. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, as if whatever had caused it had simply stopped holding its breath, and then remembered to hide again. Vesa turned slowly back toward the assembled human leaders, who were watching her with expressions she suddenly, uncomfortably, could not read at all. Admiral Kal, she said into her comm very quietly, I need you to see something. Now. Vesa Orn had seen fear on 11 different species across 9 campaigns, and she had learned to read it the way other officers read star charts. What she saw on the human Secretary-General's face was not fear. It was patience. Run the scan again, Zareth said over the comm, irritation sharpening his voice. You're telling me a reading appeared and vanished in under 4 seconds and you want me to treat it as credible? I'm telling you, Vesa said, walking briskly back toward the shuttle while keeping her escort tight around her, that whatever caused it was massive, organized, and gone before our systems could even finish characterizing it. That is not a sensor error, Admiral. That is something choosing not to be seen. Coincidence, geological. With respect, sir, I do not believe in geological coincidences that vanish the instant we start looking at them. Zerath's silence carried across the comm for a long moment. Then quieter. Finish the envoy meeting. Return to the ship. We'll discuss this in person. 3,000 kilometers away, in a briefing room buried beneath Nevada rock, General Marcus Webb watched the same sensor ghost that Vesa had seen, captured independently by Threshold's own Deep Earth monitoring array, and allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. They caught it, he said. Elena, standing beside him, frowned at the readout. Sir, that was one of ours. That was a Threshold power signature, wasn't it? Did we just reveal something? A flicker, not a reveal. Enough to make them nervous. Not enough to make them certain. Marcus rubbed a hand across his jaw, the first sign of fatigue she'd seen from him in years. Fear of the unknown is worth more to us right now than proof of the known, Elena. Let them wonder. Wondering buys us time. Time for what? You still haven't told me what we're actually building toward. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment she thought he might finally answer. Instead, his radio crackled. General, you need to see this, came the voice of Colonel Idris Cole, sharp and clipped even through the static. Cole commanded the Ravens, an experimental fighter wing so classified that even most of Threshold's staff believed it was a myth invented to boost morale. Elena had met him twice. Both times, he'd struck her as a man carrying something heavy that he refused to set down. Go ahead, Colonel. Envoy fleet's breaking formation. Looks like they're deploying ground forces to secure key population centers. Tokyo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, London. They're not waiting for our answer, sir. They're already moving pieces. Marcus's jaw tightened. Copy. Hold position. Nobody moves without my order. Sir, with respect, my sister lives 11 kilometers from where their transport is setting down in London. I know, Idris. Hold position. The line went quiet, but Elena could hear, in that silence, exactly how much it cost Cole to obey. In London, a young Corvth soldier named Trask stood at the base of a troop transport, rifle slung across his chest, watching human civilians gather at a respectful, careful distance from the cordon his unit had established around a public square. He had been told in his training that primitive species reacted to occupation in one of two ways: violent resistance, quickly and mercifully crushed, or immediate, grateful submission. He had seen both on 2 prior worlds in his short career. He was seeing neither now. The humans stood watching him, not fleeing, not fighting, not weeping. Just watching, with an unnerving stillness, the way a person watches weather they've already prepared for. An older man near the front of the crowd, gray-haired, wearing a jacket with a faded military insignia Trask didn't recognize, caught his eye and gave him the faintest, almost pitying nod. Trask had never in his life felt smaller under a species' gaze than he did in that moment. Sergeant, he said quietly to the soldier beside him. Does anyone else find this? Focus on your perimeter, Trask. Yes, Sergeant. He focused. But the feeling didn't leave. Aboard the Devourer's wake, Vesa Orn stood over a tactical display that had begun in the last hour to fill with data that made no sense to her at all. Every major human city, when cross-referenced against Threshold's brief, accidental power flicker, showed a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the same energy signature, buried, dormant, waiting. Identical patterns, dozens of them, positioned with a precision that could not be coincidence. Admiral, she said, when Zerath finally arrived on the bridge, I need you to look at this before you make any further decisions. He studied the display, and for the first time since Earth had entered his sights, she watched real uncertainty cross his face. This is beneath nearly every human population center, he said slowly. Yes. All identical. Yes. That is not primitive infrastructure. No, Admiral, it is not. Zerath stared at the map for a long, long moment, and Vesa watched something shift behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the cold recalculation of a predator who has just realized the lamb might have teeth after all. Recall the ground units, he said finally. Pull back to orbit until we understand what we're... Belay that, snapped a new voice. Commander Raxus Vel, the fleet's second-in-command and a man who had spent his career resenting Xerath's caution, stepped onto the bridge with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this would go. Admiral, with respect, we did not travel this far to retreat because of a sensor ghost and buried scrap metal. This species has no visible fleet, no visible defense grid, and no history of spacefaring technology. Whatever those readings are, they are not warships. I recommend we proceed with the show of force as planned, immediately. Raxus, Vesa started. The Council did not send us to be frightened by shadows, Vesa. Raxus turned to Xerath. Sir, give the order. One target, one demonstration. Let the humans see exactly what patience costs them. Xerath hesitated, torn between Vesa's caution and Raxus's certainty. Between decades of easy conquests and the first genuine unease he'd felt in this entire campaign. He was still hesitating when Raxus, unwilling to wait for an answer he was sure would come anyway, opened a direct channel to the orbital strike wing and gave the order himself. Target the coastal population center designated Shenzhen. Minimal yield. Send a message. Raxus, belay that order. Xerath snapped. Too late. High above the South China Sea, a Corvth strike cruiser released its payload. In Threshold's command center, alarms began screaming across every console at once. Elena watched, frozen, as a live satellite feed showed a bright, terrible flash bloom along a stretch of coastline she had visited once, years ago, on a vacation she barely remembered now. Sir, she said, voice shaking despite every year of training that told her not to let it. They just hit a civilian center. No warning, no provocation. They just did it. Marcus Webb stood very still, staring at the feed, and for the first time in 6 years, Elena saw something break loose behind his composed, careful face. Not panic, but grief, old and deep, and finally given permission to surface. Get me Colonel Cole, he said, voice low and terribly steady. Tell him Threshold is live. Across the base, claxons that had never once sounded in Elena's memory began to wail, and beneath the Nevada desert, beneath cities across the entire planet, systems that had waited in silent readiness for longer than she had been alive began, at last, to wake. Colonel Idris Cole was already strapped into his cockpit when the words "Threshold is live" crackled through his headset, and for the first time in 11 years of waiting for this exact moment, he felt no relief at all. Only ice. His sister lived 11 kilometers from where a Corvth transport had set down in London. He hadn't been able to reach her in 40 minutes. Ravens, this is Cole, he said, voice flat and controlled, the only way he knew how to sound when everything in him wanted to scream. Authorization received. Decloak sequence in 10. Weapons hot. Around him, in a hangar carved so deep into a mountain that sunlight had never once touched its floor, 32 fighters that did not officially exist began spinning up engines that ran on principles the rest of the world's aerospace industry wouldn't understand for another century. They were sleek, dark, and utterly silent even at full power, a design philosophy born from one guiding rule, hammered into every engineer who'd ever worked on them. If they never see you coming, they never learn how to stop you. Colonel, came Marcus Webb's voice, steady despite the chaos flooding every channel at Threshold. Your target is the strike wing responsible for Shenzhen. Full authorization to engage. But Idris, this is not a rescue mission. This is a message. Make it count, and make it precise. The world is about to see something it's never seen before. Give them a reason to believe it can save them. Copy that, General. Cole's hands did not shake, though his voice just barely did. Ravens, launch. Vesa Orn felt the world change before she understood why. She was still on the bridge of the Devourer's wake, still staring at Raxus Vel with the particular fury of someone whose warning has just been proven right in the worst possible way, when her tactical display lit up with 32 contacts that had not existed a heartbeat earlier. Report, Xerath snapped. Unknown craft, Admiral. 32 of them. They just appeared. No launch signature, no drive trail, nothing on approach. They were simply not there, and now they are. Cloaking technology, Raxus said, disbelief cracking his earlier bravado. That's not possible. Not from a species that still... Clearly it is possible, Vesa cut in coldly, since it is happening. On the view screen, the strike wing that had leveled a stretch of Shenzhen's coastline banked hard to reposition, and simply never completed the turn. Cole's fighters moved through the Corvth formation like a blade through smoke, weapons fire precise and merciless, targeting engines and weapon systems with a discipline that spoke of decades of simulation, not minutes of improvisation. 2 Corvth cruisers lost thrust and began tumbling toward the upper atmosphere. A third exploded outright, caught in a crossfire it never saw coming. Cole's voice, when it came over the human command channel, was ragged with something between grief and grim satisfaction. Splash 3. Strike wing is disengaging. Belay that. They're not disengaging. They're fleeing. Command. Orders? Marcus Webb's answer came without a second's hesitation. Let them run, Colonel. Let every ship in that fleet watch them run. Return to holding position. You made your point. Don't make a war out of a warning. Cole exhaled hard and pulled his squadron back into formation, watching the surviving Corvth vessels scatter toward the safety of their fleet in high orbit. Behind his cockpit's reinforced glass, he allowed himself for exactly 3 seconds to think about his sister. And to hope. On the Devourer's wake, the bridge had gone utterly silent. Zerath stared at the tactical readout, at the wreckage of 3 ships and the panicked retreat of a dozen more, and felt something he had not felt in over 40 years of military service. The cold, physical sensation of being outmatched. That is not possible, he said quietly. A pre-spaceflight species does not field cloaked fighters with that level of tactical coordination. It does not exist. It apparently does, Vesa said. She was watching the replay of the engagement with the focus of someone memorizing a language she'd only just realized she needed to learn. Look at their formation discipline, Admiral. That is not luck. That is not desperation. That is doctrine. Refined, tested doctrine. The kind that takes generations to develop. She turned to face him fully. Everything we believed about this species was a lie they allowed us to believe. The buried signatures beneath every city. The precision of that strike. I don't think we found a hidden weapon, Admiral. I think we found the very edge of something far larger, and it let us see just enough to be afraid. Raxus, pale and furious in equal measure, opened his mouth to argue, and found, for the first time since Vesa had known him, that he had nothing to say. Zerath straightened slowly, old instincts warring with new fear. Pull the fleet back to a defensive perimeter at the edge of the system. I want full sensor sweeps of that planet, subsurface and orbital, continuous, and someone find out how a species we catalogued as harmless just humiliated a Dominion strike wing without losing a single fighter. Deep beneath Nevada, Elena stood in the command center amid the controlled chaos of a base finally operating at the capacity it had trained for across decades. Analysts calling out tracking data, engineers monitoring power draw from systems she'd never even known existed until an hour ago. Marcus Webb moving between stations with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this exact nightmare 1,000 times in his head, and was even now, still afraid he hadn't rehearsed it enough. She caught him near the main tactical table, and for once she didn't ask about strategy. Was that the whole fleet? She asked quietly. The Ravens. Is that everything we have? Something in his expression made her stomach turn cold before he even answered. No, he said. That was 32 fighters, Elena. A single squadron. A fraction of what this planet has been quietly building since before either of us was born. Then why not use more? Why not end this now before they hurt anyone else? Marcus looked at her for a long moment, weighing something, and she watched him decide, not for the first time she suspected, but perhaps for the first time with her specifically, to tell her more than he was supposed to. Because the fleet isn't finished being what it needs to be, he said, and because the moment we show the Corvth everything we have, we also show it to something else. Something we built this whole program to hide from, Elena, not to fight with. Before she could ask what that meant, an alert chimed from the deep archive terminal at the far end of the room. A system so old and rarely accessed that its interface still ran on hardware from another era entirely. The duty officer manning it went pale. "General," he called, voice tight. "You need to see this. It's flagged as founder priority. Automatic trigger, tied to fleet visibility exceeding a set threshold. It's been sitting dormant for 61 years, sir. Until now." Marcus crossed the room fast, Elena at his heels, and together they read the message that scrolled slowly across the ancient screen. A recording left by people neither of them had ever met, warning a future they had clearly hoped would never arrive. "If you are reading this, the fleet has been seen. That was never supposed to happen until we were ready. Whatever brought this warning to your screen, understand what it means. The world above you now knows we are not what we appear to be, and somewhere in the dark beyond the edge of this system, so does something else. God help us all." Elena felt the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Marcus," she said slowly, "what exactly did this fleet get built to hide from?" For the first time since she'd known him, General Marcus Webb did not have an answer ready. 61 years of silence ended the moment Marcus Webb pressed his palm against a biometric scanner that hadn't been touched since before he was born, and a vault door 3 meters thick began, slowly, to grind open. "This wasn't in any briefing I ever received," Elena said, following him down a stairwell that descended far below even Threshold's deepest known levels. "It wasn't in any briefing anyone's ever received," Marcus said. "Only 3 people alive currently have clearance for what's down here. I'm one of them. As of the founder priority trigger going active, you're about to become the second." The archive room, when they reached it, was small, cold, and lined with data cores that predated digital storage as Elena understood it. Physical records, handwritten logs, photographs of men and women in uniforms decades out of fashion, standing in front of the earliest, crudest version of the very facility she now worked in. Marcus pulled a thick folder from a sealed case and set it on the table between them. "In 1987, he said, a joint deep space listening program, the real precursor to Threshold, picked up a transmission from an automated probe humanity had launched 11 years earlier. The probe was supposed to be silent by then, drifting. Dead. It wasn't dead. It was screaming." Elena said nothing, letting him find the words at his own pace. It had encountered something on the edge of the system. Not the Corvth. This was decades before we knew they existed. Something else. Something that didn't communicate, didn't negotiate, and didn't stop. The probe's last transmission showed an object powerful enough to disable it from a distance we still can't reliably measure. Whatever it was, it noticed us. And then, for reasons nobody has ever understood, it left. "Left," Elena repeated. "Just left?" "For 60 years, yes. But the people who built the first version of this program didn't believe in luck. They believed that whatever had noticed Earth might return, and that when it did, humanity needed to be ready in a way no single nation, no single military, could manage alone. So they built something bigger, quieter, slower. A fleet designed not for the wars we were already fighting each other, but for a war none of us could see coming, hidden so completely that even most of the people building it, generation after generation, never fully understood what they were building toward." Elena sat down slowly, the full weight of it settling into her chest. "The Corvth were never the real threat." "No," Marcus said quietly. "The Corvth are the unlucky ones who found us first. And now, because of Raxus Vel's impatience and Zirath Kal's ambition, we've had to show our hand decades before this fleet was ever meant to be ready. Which means whatever's out past Pluto might be watching too. In a medical bay 3 levels up, a very different reckoning was taking place. Trask had been captured 2 hours earlier when his patrol transport, sent to reinforce the retreating strike wing, was brought down by a Raven fighter he never even saw. He'd expected execution. He'd been trained to expect execution. Every Dominion briefing on human barbarism had prepared him for exactly that. Instead, a human medic named Priya Anand had spent the last 40 minutes carefully resetting a fracture in his lower limb, murmuring instructions to an assistant in a language he didn't understand, occasionally glancing at him with an expression that wasn't hatred at all. It was closer to concern. "You're not going to kill me," he said, more statement than question, testing the words in halting translator-assisted English. "Not planning on it, no," Priya said without looking up from her work. "Why not? I was sent to occupy your city." "You were sent," she said simply. "Doesn't mean you chose it, and even if you had, that's not really the point of medicine, is it?" She finished securing the splint and finally met his eyes. "You're scared. Anyone can see that. Scared people aren't usually the ones who need punishing first." Trask sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, comparing it against everything the Dominion had ever taught him about the species he'd been sent to conquer. "Your admiral bombed a city that never fired on him," he said quietly. "My commanders would call that strength." "We'd call it something else," Priya said. Later, alone under guard, Trask made a decision that would have gotten him executed under Dominion law without trial. He asked to speak to someone in command, and when Elena arrived, tired and hollow-eyed from the archive room, he told her everything he knew about fleet movements, chain of command, and the growing rift between Zerath and Raxusvel, not out of loyalty to Earth but because some quieter, more stubborn part of him had decided in the space of a single afternoon that he did not want to be the kind of soldier who bombed cities that never fired first. Aboard the Devourer's wake, that same rift had become impossible to ignore. "You should have relieved him of duty the moment he gave that order," Vesa said, standing over Zerath's desk with none of her usual careful restraint. "Raxus bombed a civilian center without authorization and cost us 3 ships and any advantage of surprise we might have had, and you did nothing. Raxus has powerful allies on the council," Zerath said tiredly. "Relieving him now after a defeat looks like weakness. It invites a vote of no confidence I cannot survive. So instead you'll let him keep making decisions that get us killed." Zerath said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. Raxus himself found Vesa alone in a corridor an hour later, his earlier bravado replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You've made your objections known, Vesa. Noted and dismissed. The Council did not send this fleet to retreat from a planet of primitives because their pest control turned out to have teeth. I intend to finish what I started, with or without the Admiral's approval. That is treason, Raxus." "That is initiative," he said, "and initiative is rewarded in the end, far more than caution ever is." He walked away before she could respond, already composing in his head the message he intended to send the Council behind Zerath's back, a request for reinforcements and authorization to escalate. Vesa returned to the bridge and found Zerath staring at the same subsurface data that had haunted her for days, his expression unreadable. "I've reconsidered," he said before she could speak. "You were right from the start. This was never going to be an easy conquest, and I let my own ambition convince me otherwise." He straightened, some of the old iron returning to his posture, though tempered now with something like genuine fear. "Recall the fleet from the outer perimeter. I want everything we have in a defensive formation around this planet by nightfall, their time. If Raxus wants to escalate, he'll do it under my authority or not at all. And if the Council overrules you, then they can explain to the survivors why we ignored the one officer on this ship who was right from the beginning." Before Vesa could answer, an alert chimed across every station on the bridge simultaneously, not from Earth, but from deep space, well beyond the system's outer edge where sensors rarely returned anything but silence. Something enormous had just entered the system's outer dark, something that matched no signature in the Dominion's databases, moving on a trajectory that would bring it, in a matter of days, directly toward the sound and light of a war it had not been invited to. Zerath stared at the reading, and for the second time in this campaign, felt the floor shift beneath a certainty he'd carried his entire career. "Vesa," he said quietly, "tell me that isn't heading for Earth." She checked the trajectory twice before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost every trace of its usual composure. "It's not heading for Earth, Admiral," she said. "It's heading for us. All of us. The order that changed everything was 7 words long, and Marcus Webb had waited his entire career to give it. Threshold command to all stations. Decloak. For 3 full seconds, nothing visible happened at all. Then the sky over every ocean on Earth began, quietly and impossibly, to fill. Ships that had orbited cloaked for decades in lunar farside shipyards, hidden inside asteroid camouflaged docks, buried in silos beneath mountain ranges nobody had ever thought to question. Thousands of them, generations of engineering compressed into a single silent unveiling, shimmered into visibility around the Corvth fleet like a held breath finally released. Not 32 fighters this time, not a warning shot. The whole of it, all at once, exactly as the original architects of Threshold had always hoped it might one day be ready to be. On the bridge of the Devourer's wake, Vesa Orn watched her tactical display fill with contacts until the readout itself began struggling to render them all, and understood, in a single cold instant, that every assumption the Dominion had ever made about this planet had been not just wrong, but catastrophically, deliberately wrong. "Admiral," she said very quietly, "we are outnumbered." Zirath did not answer immediately. He was staring at the viewscreen, at a sky that had gone in the space of a few heartbeats from empty to absolutely full, and for the first time in his long, decorated career, he understood exactly what it felt like to be the weaker fleet. "Hold position," he said finally, voice hoarse. "Do not fire first. Do you hear me? Nobody fires first." But somewhere on the far side of the fleet, Raxus Vel had already made his decision, and his gunnery crews did not wait for confirmation from a bridge he no longer fully trusted. Colonel Idris Cole felt the battle begin before he heard the order, in the way his ship's sensors lit up with a wall of incoming fire aimed at the newly revealed human formations. He didn't wait for permission either. "Ravens, all squadrons, engage defensive pattern Delta. Protect the line. Nobody breaks through to the surface, do you understand me?" Nobody. What followed was not the clean, one-sided demonstration of the previous engagement. This was war. Full, brutal, and costly in a way the earlier skirmish had only hinted at. Dominion cruisers, driven by Raxus's fury and desperation, tore into the human formation with everything they had. And for every ship humanity's hidden fleet destroyed, another paid a price the world would spend years grieving. Cole watched 2 Raven pilots he'd trained personally vanish from his display within the first 10 minutes, and felt something in his chest go hollow and hard at the same time. He thought, briefly, of his sister in London, of the message she'd finally managed to send him an hour earlier. "I'm okay, I'm safe, go do what you were built to do," and let it steady his hands instead of breaking them. "Command, this is Cole. We're holding the line, but Raxus's wing isn't slowing down. Requesting authorization to push into their formation directly." "Denied." Marcus's voice cut back, tight with strain. "We are not the aggressors here, Colonel. We hold. We do not become the thing we've spent 60 years hiding from." Cole gritted his teeth and held. On the ground, Elena Reyes was 300 kilometers from the nearest fighting, coordinating something that felt, in its own quiet way, just as important as anything happening in orbit. The evacuation of the bombed coastal district near Shenzhen, where thousands of survivors were still trapped beneath collapsed structures as aftershocks from the original strike continued to rattle unstable buildings. "We have people alive in Sector 7, a rescue coordinator told her over comms, voice ragged with exhaustion. "But the structure's compromised. If we go in wrong, we lose the whole team on top of the people we're trying to save." Elena thought of Marcus's words from days earlier. "Don't leave anyone behind. Not while there's still a version of this where we don't have to," and made the call herself. "Send them in. I'll take responsibility." She stayed on that channel for 6 hours, coordinating rescue teams through a battle raging in the sky above them, refusing every order to retreat to a hardened shelter, until the last confirmed survivor in Sector 7 had been pulled free. When it was finally over, when the last stretcher was loaded and the last name crossed off a list that had started with hundreds, she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to sit on a piece of rubble and shake, before standing back up and moving to the next crisis. It was in that 30 seconds that Trask found her, moving carefully on his splinted leg, escorted by a wary but no longer hostile guard. "I have information," he said. About Raxus Vel. About what he intends to do if this battle turns against him. Elena stood, exhaustion forgotten. Tell me. What Trask knew was this. Raxus, humiliated and cornered, had quietly rerouted Dominion communications through a backup relay only a handful of officers were aware of. A failsafe that would allow him to bypass Zerath entirely and call for an orbital bombardment of Earth's surface, indiscriminate and total, the moment he judged the battle unwinnable. It was in Dominion military law an act of treason. It was also, Trask pointed out grimly, exactly the kind of order that got carried out anyway, because the officers beneath Raxus had been trained their whole careers not to question a superior mid-battle. I can disrupt the relay, Trask said. From inside. I know the protocols, but I'd need access to a transmitter, and I would need it before he gives that order, not after. Elena stared at him, weighing 6 years of training that told her never to trust an enemy combatant against 3 days of watching this particular enemy combatant choose, again and again, not to be one. Why help us? She asked. Really? Trask thought about the medic who'd set his leg without hatred, about the old man in London who'd nodded at him with something like pity instead of fear, about an admiral willing to burn a city to save his own reputation. Because I finally understand what my commanders meant when they warned us about this planet, he said quietly. They just had the reason wrong. The transmitter access came through a relay station threshold maintained on the edge of its jurisdiction, and Trask worked fast, guided remotely by Threshold's communications team, and driven by the growing certainty that he had only minutes before Raxus, watching his own fleet crumble under sustained human resistance. Made the call Trask feared he would. He was right. With 90 seconds to spare, Trask severed the backup relay entirely, cutting Raxus off from the bombardment command he'd been seconds from issuing, and in the process, exposed his own location to a security sweep that Raxus's loyalists traced within minutes. The last transmission Elena received from him was calm, almost peaceful. It's done. Tell the medic. Tell Priya. Thank you. The line went dead. Elena never learned in that moment whether it had gone dead because the relay failed or because someone had found him first. She would not find out for hours yet, and when she finally did, it would be one more grief added to a day already full of them. In orbit, stripped of his final gambit and watching his forces buckle under a defense he could no longer deny was overwhelming, Raxus Vel made one last, desperate call, not to his own command structure, but directly to the Council, demanding immediate reinforcement and authorization to use whatever weapons remained available to him. He never got his answer, because at that exact moment, on every sensor across both fleets simultaneously, a new set of contacts crossed the outer edge of the solar system, vast, silent, and utterly indifferent to the war it was arriving in the middle of. Ships unlike anything in either species' databases, moving with a cold, deliberate purpose that made even the hidden fleet's overwhelming numbers feel suddenly, terribly small. They did not hail. They did not slow down. They opened fire on the nearest targets they could reach, and those targets belonged to both sides equally. On the Devourer's wake, Vesa Orn watched half a dozen readouts turn red in the span of seconds, and felt, for the first time in her long, disciplined career, something close to true terror. "Admiral," she said, voice shaking, "I don't think that's a Dominion fleet, and I don't think it's human." Deep beneath Nevada, Elena watched the same impossible contacts appear on Threshold's own displays, and felt the floor of the command center seem to tilt beneath her. Marcus Webb, standing beside her, went very pale. Pale in the specific way of a man finally seeing, after 61 years of preparation, the exact thing he had always been most afraid of. He reached for the comm, hand trembling, and managed only a single sentence before the line dissolved into static and silence. "Elena, the array. Deploy the array. It was never meant to be a weapon." The transmission cut out entirely. Every screen in the command center flickered once, twice, and went dark. Silence, Elena Reyes would later say, was the worst sound she had ever heard. For 11 full seconds, every screen in Threshold's command center stayed dark, and in that darkness she did not think about the ancient fleet tearing through both human and Corvth ships in orbit. She thought about a man who had recruited her at 26, who had never once looked surprised in 6 years of knowing him, and whose voice had just cut off mid-sentence for the first time in her life. Then the emergency backup systems groaned to life, screens flickering back one row at a time, and the command center exploded into noise again. Alarms, shouted status reports, a dozen voices demanding direction at once. Elena did not have time to grieve. She had time to act, and she chose the second thing because it was the only thing Marcus Webb had ever taught her, that she trusted completely. "Report," she snapped, stepping into the space at the tactical table that he had occupied 30 seconds earlier. "Someone tell me what happened to the general." "Core overload, ma'am. Deploying the full fleet at once put a strain on Threshold's primary systems nobody planned for. We lost contact with his section of the facility. Emergency crews are already moving in, but..." The technician hesitated. "There's a structural collapse between here and there, ma'am. It's going to take time." Elena forced the fear down into a small, hard place where it couldn't stop her hands from working. "Then we don't have time to wait for him to tell us what he meant. Pull up everything Threshold has on something called the Array. Now." In orbit, the battle had become something closer to chaos than war. Two exhausted fleets, human and Corvth alike, now being torn apart by a third force that recognized no side, no flag, no plea for parley. Colonel Idris Cole watched 3 Raven fighters vanish in the space of a single breath, their pilots gone before he could even register their call signs on the display. "Command, this is Cole. We are getting cut to pieces out here and I don't have orders. Talk to me." For a long, terrible moment, no answer came from Threshold at all. Then, unexpectedly, a voice broke through on an open channel. Not human. Zerath Kal, battered and desperate, hailing every vessel in range regardless of allegiance. "This is Admiral Zerath Kal of the Corvth Dominion, broadcasting on all frequencies. I do not know what these ships are. I do not believe any force here does. If Earth has any weapon capable of stopping them, I am formally requesting a ceasefire between our fleets, effective immediately, for as long as it takes to survive what's happening around us." Cole stared at the transmission for exactly 2 seconds before keying his own channel. "Command, are you hearing this? The Corvth Admiral just asked for a ceasefire." Silence. Then, finally, a new voice. Elena's, steady despite everything Cole could hear straining beneath it. "Cole, this is Reyes. I'm assuming tactical command until the general is recovered. Accept the ceasefire. All Raven squadrons, hold fire on Dominion vessels and redirect defensive efforts against the unknown fleet only. We fight the actual threat now." Elena had exactly 4 minutes to make sense of decades of buried records, and she spent every second of them with Trask's final words echoing in her chest alongside Marcus's cut-off warning. It was never meant to be a WEP. She found it in the same deep archive that had held the Founder's original message, a system logged under a name that meant nothing on its own, Continuity Array, cross-referenced with a mission file so old it had been transcribed by hand before it was ever digitized. She read it twice to be sure she understood it, and when she did, her breath caught. "It's not a weapon," she said aloud, to the room, to no one, to the ghost of a man she refused to believe was gone. It never was. The Founders, 61 years earlier, had drawn a conclusion from that first vanishing probe transmission that nobody after them had dared question aloud. The entity that attacked and then withdrew hadn't been testing Earth's strength. It had been reacting to something, a pattern, a signature, a shape of aggression it couldn't distinguish from whatever it had once fled or fought long before humanity existed at all. The Array wasn't built to fight it. It was built to answer it. A broadcast decades in the making, designed to prove, mathematically, unmistakably, that the species sending it was not the threat the ancient fleet believed it to be. The catch, buried in the Founder's own notes and handwriting gone brittle with age, was brutally simple. Activating it would strip power from every defensive system Threshold's fleet still had online for the full duration of the transmission. If it failed, humanity's remaining ships would be defenseless at the exact moment they needed defense most. Elena stood over the activation console, hand hovering, and thought of Marcus's voice. "It was never meant to be ready until we were certain." and understood finally why he had never told her. Because there had never been a way to be certain. Only a choice, left for whoever was standing here when it mattered. "Ma'am," said the technician beside her, voice tight. "If you're going to do this, Orbital Command needs the order now. The fleet's taking losses every second we wait." Elena closed her eyes for exactly one breath. "Do it," she said. "Broadcast the array. All power, all frequencies. Now." In orbit, every human vessel dimmed simultaneously, weapon systems flickering dark as power rerouted planet-wide into a single signal aimed at the heart of the ancient fleet's formation. For 11 agonizing seconds, humanity's ships hung in space defenseless, and both the ancient enemy and the battered Dominion fleet could have ended the war in that single window. Neither did. The ancient ships paused, not retreated, not withdrawn, simply paused, weapon systems going still across their entire formation as something in the signal reached whatever passed for their understanding. Vesa Orn watched it happen from the Devourer's Wake's bridge and felt for the first time since entering this system something other than fear. "They're listening," she breathed. "Admiral, they're actually listening." The pause held for nearly a full minute, the longest minute of Elena's life, before the ancient fleet began, slowly, and without any further communication at all, to withdraw, retreating back toward the outer dark from which it had come, leaving behind wreckage from both human and Corvth ships, and a silence that felt, this time, like relief instead of dread. They offered no explanation, no parting message, no proof of what they had been, or why they had come. They simply left, the way they apparently always had, and took most of humanity's remaining questions with them. It took rescue crews 6 more hours to reach Marcus Webb, buried beneath a collapsed section of Threshold's deepest levels, alive but barely. A fractured spine, a punctured lung, and a stubbornness that had apparently kept him conscious long enough to redirect emergency power to his own section before the collapse cut him off entirely. Colonel Idris Cole, landing at Threshold within the hour to check on the base in person, found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with an unlikely figure at the edge of the rescue site. Trask, alive after all, having survived the security sweep that traced his signal by the thin margin of a maintenance tunnel he'd barely managed to reach in time. "You helped dig him out?" Cole asked, watching the Corvth soldier's splinted leg with open disbelief. "I owed a debt," Trask said simply. "Your medic, your commander, this planet. I'm still working out exactly who I owed it to. Maybe all of you." They pulled Marcus free together, human and Corvth hands on the same stretcher, and Elena, arriving just in time to see it, allowed herself, finally, the 30 seconds of grief and relief she'd been postponing since the moment his voice had cut off in her ear. "You scared the hell out of me," she told him, gripping his hand as the medics worked. "Had to make sure you'd take the shot without me," he rasped, managing something close to a smile. "Looks like I was right to trust you." In the weeks that followed, Zareth Kal did something no Dominion admiral had done in the recorded history of the Empire's expansion. He returned to Council chambers not with a report of conquest, but with a formal recommendation that Earth be classified not as a subject world, but as a recognized power. A species that had, in the space of a single terrible week, revealed a depth of strength, restraint, and quiet preparation that no other world the Dominion had encountered had ever shown. Raxus Vel was recalled for court-martial. Vesa Orn, in a decision that surprised even herself, requested and was granted a posting as the Dominion's first liaison to Earth, the beginning, however cautious, of something neither side had words for yet. Elena stood months later on the roof of the Nevada facility that had defined her entire adult life, watching starlight catch on the hulls of ships that no longer needed to hide, patrol vessels drifting openly across the night sky for the first time in the program's 61-year history. No longer a secret weighing on the shoulders of a handful of people sworn never to speak of it. Marcus Webb, still recovering, still stubborn, stood beside her in a wheelchair he complained about constantly and refused every offer of help climbing out of. "We still don't know what they were," Elena said quietly, watching the sky. "The ones who left." "No," Marcus agreed. Maybe we never will. Does that scare you? He considered the question longer than she expected. It used to. I spent 61 years, most of them not even mine, inherited from people who died before I was born, preparing for a day I hoped would never come. And when it finally did, we didn't win by being the strongest thing out there. We won because enough people, across enough generations, chose to be ready instead of afraid. That's not nothing, Elena. That might be the whole point. Above them, the fleet that had waited so long in silence caught the last of the sunset on its hulls, no longer hidden, no longer holding its breath, simply present at last, exactly as it had always been meant to be. Earth had never needed to prove it was the strongest world in the sky. It only ever needed to prove it was ready. And at last, quietly, without fanfare, it finally was.